This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post, brought to you by the Fort Hall School of Government, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 25th of February 2020, and I am 2J.
I am JM.
And I am GK, and in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, pillars of greed. In the Standard, the political bulldozer. And in the Star, KPA employee faces probe over 90 million shilling deposit. Mouthful.
Yes.
Shall we begin with the Daily Nation? What are these pillars of greed?
Pillars of greed.
Yes.
So again, the dailies have gone back to this question about, was the SGR worth what we spent?
Yeah.
So in this story, they call it a mega ripoff, more than a gravy train. The SGR project was an outright robbery. So in this story, they kind of lay out some of the costs that they say were inflated. So they talk about printers, about cameras, computers, how some of the Chinese officials who came to be part of the project were given, I think, a 3 million shilling budget for their offices, their homes and whatnot.
Yeah.
However,
I saw 1 billion shillings worth of grass.
But you must admit the grass looks very nice.
Very pretty stations.
Yeah, however, I think a lot of the problem with this story and with all the stories that cover the SGR is that they miss a lot of the fundamental points around the SGR and what it's worth.
Yeah.
So I think one of the first things that we have to start with is a fallacy that the Kenyan SGR was more expensive than the Tanzanian SGR or even the Ethiopian one. So I think one big thing we forget is land compensation.
Yeah.
Unlike Ethiopia and Tanzania, where the government can come and just say, this land, we're taking it right now and use it for the better good. In Kenya, there's land compensation that we have to take into account. I think the government spent billions. That's a large chunk of that portion was on giving people money. And I know that, market share then the price of land did then go up because as people saw the government is dishing out money, let's ask for more. That did happen. But I think land compensation is a huge issue. The other thing is that the SGR for Tanzania, over the 1,400 kilometers, is going to cost them $7.5 billion over 5 years. In the end, that is more expensive than ours. Then the most important takeaway that I have that the newspapers seem to miss is the fact that Kenya paid for a class 1 SGR. Tanzania paid for a class 2 SGR. So just some explanations about what those differences are. A class 1 SGR is safer. It has higher specifications and it allows for no interruptions of the train, which means that at no point does the SGR ever stop for roads, for pedestrians, for animals. So they took into consideration the ecology of the ground in doing this. So our class 1 SGR, yes, cost more, but it also allows us to have a second, a double track, and it allows for a safer train at the end of the day. And I think that when they talk about the Tanzanian SGR being electric, they fail to take into consideration, again, that Tanzania just doesn't have the output to have an electrical train. They make 1,500 megawatts of electricity every year. Kenya makes 2,600 megawatts, and even we cannot afford to have an electric train. So I think that if we're going to talk about pillars of greed, let's look at the facts first.
Put it in context.
Put it into context,
Definitely.
I know it's a lot of information to take
in.
in.
But really good. I think you've broken it down very well.
And there's so much more.
And debunked this entire story.
Yes. However, on the flip side, let me play devil's advocate. There are some places where things were way above market rate. There are things that were inflated, and I think we also have to pay attention to that. Because I think in Kenya, we definitely need stronger institutions. You need to be able to sit in your role and say, what role am I supposed to play here?
And how much should I charge?
And what responsibility do I have to my people as a Kenyan citizen?
Very true.
But we do have a 3-part criteria that we use to break down the headlines. We ask ourselves, is it topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? I like it. I like the visual image. One thing I will say, if you ever take a drive down to the coast and see the SGR along, it's beautiful.
It is, and it respects the ground. It respects the animals and nature.
So we're putting that in the parking bay.
Parking bay.
All right.
And then we have the Standard, the political bulldozer.
So here we have a very informative, mainly descriptive and historical piece on Raila and his rise to power to where he is now. They recall all the bold moves that he pulled in the 90s after his father passed on in 94. He quit Fort Kenya, he resigned his Langata parliamentary seat, and then ran for it again afresh under NDP. He won it in 97, he ran for president, he came third, and that's when he basically consolidated all of Nyanza under his grip. And then 98, he forms an alliance with with KANU, and eventually swallows dissolves his party, joins KANU. But in the run-up to the December election of 2002, he basically walks out of KANU with a whole bunch of people who were KANU supporters for the longest time. And so the piece is getting us to think about Raila now and how much damage he's doing to Jubilee.
Oh my days.
He's coming to divide Uhuru and Ruto.
When I read this, I literally thought, when he swore himself in, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to show Raila no mercy. And then we showed him mercy, and then he came into Jubilee, and now he's just
eating Jubilee from the inside.
And so the question they're posing here is this a scheme going on? Is he being used? You know, for instance, is he being used by Uhuru to do politics? How does this end for him?
Exactly.
A lot for him, I think, hangs on the balance of how BBI will turn out. So
and perhaps,
so wait and see.
Are political vehicles in this country very sacred? I feel like
I don't think so. No.
As soon as it is done, it's thrown away, and a new one comes along.
Good
what
headline.
do we think
It's
of
a
the
good
headline?
headline.
Yeah, we park it as well. We're parking 2 for 2 there. So in the Star, there is a KPA employee that is facing a probe over 90 million shillings deposit. So the long short of it is there's a Kenya Ports Authority employee called Anthony Mohanji, who is involved in a case of mysterious transactions that have been flagged. So he receives 68.2 million from Kenya Ports Authority through one of his companies. And in December 3rd, 2018, he makes 3 separate withdrawals of this same money. Then the next day, he transfers about 50 million to Telkom Kenya Limited. Now, Telkom is going through a merger with Airtel, and so there's a lot of things, I think, up for sale. I'm not sure. However, this property in Kileleshwa is what he was trying to get. This money has since been frozen. So it's in the Telkom Kenya account, but it has been frozen pending investigation. February 6th, 2019, a year later, he receives another 10 million from Kenya Ports Authority. And he is alleged to be part of another scandal that's going on at the ports. But I think it's also too soon to tell what's really going on.
It is
But let me ask, why does he deserve a headline?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And I think, for me, when I initially saw it, I thought this is a sponsored...
Must be a sponsored headline.
So the architects of whatever scheme is going on, someone is being told we're coming. We're hot on your heels.
Must be a very powerful person in KPA, obviously.
But I think we toss it.
We toss it. Essays.
Terrible wording.
All right, between the Standard and the Daily Nation.
I like the pillars of greed. I like the image. I like the...
As much as I don't agree with the story, it's an effective headline.
Yes. So it's between the political bulldozer and pillars of greed.
Are you guys gonna support these shallow, totally without insight journalists?
But as DM likes to remind us, this is winning headlines, not winning stories. So I think we need to stay true to
our criteria.
I'm gonna go with a political bulldozer, but it seems like you guys carry the day.
There you have it. Daily Nation gives us our winning headline. Onto the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a 3-part criteria. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy? So in the Daily Nation, Dula is drawn a car accident that has happened. We have Sonko, who has overturned in his learner's vehicle, and the number plate says Nairobi County. But curiously, there is a battery named impeachment motion that has been plugged into the car to jumpstart this Nairobi County. And I'm guessing the only way they will jumpstart it is to get rid of him. Is the idea there?
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, I don't know if I was a fan of this, but it's an interesting cartoon.
It's a funny cartoon. I like it. I like it.
So are we parking?
We park it.
Okay. This one made me laugh.
In the Star.
So Ozone in the Star has drawn a caricature of none other than WSR, William Ruto, in his pastor's uniform, and he's holding a plug to a speaker. And then next to him is Raila, a caricature of Raila in his reggae uniform with a beanie, matching beanie with Uhuru Kenyatta as well. Except Uhuru Kenyatta is playing his violin like a guitar. So I don't know if he's pretending to know what reggae looks and sounds like. But I guess it's a play on the nobody can stop reggae and DP coming out and saying, well, we can stop it if it is divisive. So if the message behind BBI is to unite Kenyans, why is it taking on this tone?
And this echoes what he was saying in church the other day.
Exactly.
And hence also why they've drawn him with that
pastor.
Love it.
I think it is a good cartoon.
Yes.
All right, and in the Standard.
Here we have the Standard. Gado. This looks eerie familiar. There's a train written BBI. It looks like it's not going anywhere. And there's lots of Kenyans or Wanjikos on them. And you can see Raila in the front. You can see UHURU Kenyatta and a whole bunch of political characters.
People from all walks of life.
From all walks of life. Everybody is boarding, but the train is going nowhere.
This has to be a repetition. The moment you said a train that's going nowhere, it triggered something. This is definitely
I feel like we've seen it.
We'll search the archives.
Humorous though.
I still like the Star.
I agree completely. The Star is far better.
So we toss that.
There you have it. Our Star gives us our winning cartoon. What is our final thought?
And now our final thought. It is inspired by a book entitled The Making of the Atomic Bomb, written by Richard Rhodes in 1987. So in this book, Rhodes provides a detailed account of how the making of the atomic bomb came about. So he blends the history of science with a glimpse into how politicians and scientists during wartime, World War II, viewed this new weapon. So for this detailed documentation of the development of the most destructive war weapon ever created, Rhodes received widespread recognition and awards, primarily because of the way in which he told this story. So he covers history, politics, ethics, and the central figures around this time. So just before we get into this book, I think it's important that we break down how an atomic bomb works. Bear with me, I'm not a scientist. So, both atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs are kinds of nuclear bombs, meaning that energy comes from their nuclear reactions. But the way that they release their energy is different. So for the purpose of this book, we're just going to focus on the atomic bomb. So atomic bombs use something called a nuclear fission. This splits a bigger atom. I think from Science 101, we remember what an atom is. It splits a bigger atom into two smaller ones to create energy. And this explosive power results from the sudden release of energy when these two atoms split. So when this is triggered, these devices release a huge amount of energy in the form of a nuclear explosion. And I think we all understand like that mushroom effect, right? So in this book, he traces the concepts of the atom as far back as ancient Greece and briefly outlines atomic research in the 20th century. And he suggests that the real beginning of the idea of nuclear fission and its use as a weapon originated in September 1933 from Leo Szilard, a Hungarian theoretical physicist who was a former student of Albert Einstein. So in 1939, several scientists became aware of the theoretical possibility of creating an atomic bomb, this weapon of mass destruction. And they understood how it would vastly it had the potential to overshadow existing military weapons. But as Hitler came into power in Germany in 1933, many of Europe's greatest physicists emigrated and fled from Nazi persecution, and they wanted to avoid Hitler having the power to use a nuclear weapon himself. So many of these scientists fled to the US, but it wasn't until the US joined World War II in 1941 that a priority was given to the research and funding of these atomic weapons. And this took place under a secret project called the Manhattan Project. And so what we find in this book is that Rhodes addresses the difficult moral and ethical dilemmas faced by the scientists of this Manhattan Project, particularly the implications of creating such a strong and dangerous weapon and not knowing what the consequences might be years later.
So I read a bit about the Manhattan Project. So despite its name, it actually didn't occur in Manhattan. Its two famous sites were actually in New Mexico and Tennessee. That's where they set up the labs and would test them out. But so basically the Manhattan Project was a famously known United States-led endeavor to create the first atomic bomb, and it successfully led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right? And the total surrender of Japan, ending World War II. However, like you've said, integral to the start of the Manhattan Project were scientists. So Einstein was integral in writing this letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, to say, listen, if Hitler creates this weapon, we're going to be in big trouble and we can't afford that. So based on that, in 1939, Roosevelt commissions the Advisory Committee on Uranium. And so basically they were told, come study nuclear chain reactions and uranium enrichment. Then fast forward a few years later, in 1942, the Army Corps engineers joined this initiative. So it's not just scientists, which makes it then a military initiative. And with this, they start weaponizing nuclear energy. So in 1945, we have the first testing of the atomic bombs through something called the Trinity test, which is famous for having that mushroom image and that thing that went, the cloud of smoke that went 40,000 feet up into the sky. And this is what ushers in the atomic age, according to him. And so with the help of Oppenheimer, one of the scientists, they create two different types of bombs. The little boy, which is the one that was used in Hiroshima, and that was uranium based. And then there was the fat man, which is plutonium based. And that one didn't work so well, so they eased away from it. And the other things we don't know about the Manhattan Project, or came to light much later, is that there were many fatalities, about 24 in the creation of this atomic bomb. They even nicknamed one of the reactors the Demon Core because it killed 2 scientists. And so they would be exposed to these lethal doses of radiation, and days later they would be dead, right? But then there's a question, a moral question, that despite the cost of this project being about $2 billion, was it a success? And would you call, you know, the explosion of this atomic bomb a success, right? Given that 150,000 or 200,000 people died as a result. But if it met the mission, which was to detonate these bombs, then it met its criteria and it was a tick. However, some would argue that stopping Japan in this way was a war crime. So there's that other argument. Anyway, so at the end of World War II, so the bombs have gone off. The US formed the Atomic Energy Commission, and this is what the Manhattan Project, I think, has been useful for humanity, which was all the technologies that were developed during the Manhattan Project have now come into our everyday lives. The MRI machine that you now use, the radiation therapy that's used on some type of cancers came from this project. So they developed these technologies further. And then in 1964, the president now at that time was Lyndon Johnson, and he says, okay, the US has had enough of its monopoly over nuclear energy, and so now they allow other private individuals to start to own nuclear materials.
Interesting.
It was very
dangerous though.
Very interesting. This is a very well written book, very detailed, quite lengthy, but good all the same. You've talked about the scientists. I'm going to talk about the politicians. Right? The politics around deploying these 2 massive bombs, the Fat Man and the other one that you talked about. So the year is 1944, and President Roosevelt is elected for a 4th term in office. And by the way, before Truman, America had no term limits for presidents. So here is Roosevelt elected for a 4th term, but he's very ill. And the Axis powers are slowly crumbling at the hand of the Allied powers in Europe and in the Pacific. And so on the Pacific front in Southeast Asia and Japan, the war is reaching new levels of savagery because the Japanese are increasingly getting cornered by the Americans. And so now they're getting really, really desperate. And the Americans are inching closer and closer. They want this war to come to an end. And so the Japanese, in retaliation, start doing the kamikaze strikes. And these are the suicide missions that they would often do. And in early 1945, some of these kamikaze missions cost as many as 10,000 US soldiers' lives. And so, and they sink even about 34 battleships. And so Roosevelt is like, guys, this has to come to an end. And his commander, his chief of staff, a guy called William Leahy, was in favor of deployment of troops on the ground, as opposed to using now the bomb that was just about to be finished. And so this guy called William Leahy wants to do the conventional attack. And so on the 10th of March, they advise for an aerial bombardment of Tokyo. And they succeed. America drops 1,600 tons of bombs on Tokyo on the night of March 10th. They kill about 100,000 Japanese at one go, and they flatten 25 square kilometers of Tokyo.
Oh, goodness.
And the next step now is to prepare to deploy 1.6 million Americans into Japan. But as they're doing so, on the 12th of April, Delano Roosevelt dies.
Oh, wow.
And in comes his vice, a guy called Harry Truman. Harry Truman, until then, had not discussed the Manhattan Project with Roosevelt. In fact, he didn't even know about it, apparently. So, his first briefing in cabinet, he's pulled aside by two men, a guy called Leahy and another guy called James Bynes. Yeah. And they're now telling him about the Manhattan Project. This thing is just about to finish. And, we could potentially use it to end this war. Yeah. But he's a little bit skeptical. And so, he finds himself then having to lean on a lot of the people in the War Council in America. But he parts with the company of the guy called William Leahy, who was the chief of staff to Roosevelt, and he looks to a new confidant by the name James Bynes that I've talked about. So he makes Bynes the new Secretary of State, and also basically the chief advisor in terms of war affairs. And so Bynes tells him, look, to end this war, we may have to deploy the nuclear weapon. Wow. But Truman says, okay, but as a last resort. Yeah. And as the month progresses, after they've buried Roosevelt, in May of 1945, a spanner is thrown into the works. Joseph Stalin defeats Nazi Germany, and the war is won in Europe. So once it's won in Europe, he now turns his attention to the Pacific, and he says, look, we can now put our Russian men into the Pacific so that we can spread communism also into Japan and Southeast Asia. And so this now becomes a geopolitical threat for America because of that. And so Truman is in a dilemma. He can either invade without Soviet help and risk casualties, huge casualties in part of America, or enlist Russian help and risk communism spreading through the Pacific. And so on the 16th of July, a solution presents itself. The atomic bomb is finally tested, it succeeds. And so 10 days later, on the 26th of July, Truman says, you know what, guys, he tells Japan, if you don't surrender unconditionally, we're going to blow you up. And Japan says, we're in this to death. Japan had even trained soldiers. They had child soldiers as young as 6-7 years old who knew how to wield weapons. They were calling it the suicide mission. And finally, he drops the first bomb like a day later. A few days later, he drops the second one. And at that point, Japan basically surrenders and says, you know what, this war is won. And that's the basically
end of World War II.
End of World War II. Interesting thing is that Japan ended up becoming a very strong ally now of
the US.
Japan had committed serious war crimes against all the Southeast Asian countries, but that was all buried under the rug because of the threat of communism, and the rest is history.
Interesting.
The things Americans fear, really.
I'll tell you.
So on a day where we had a winning cartoon from The Star and a winning headline from the Daily Nation, I want to leave you with this. Oppenheimer, the scientist, told us, it is a profound and necessary truth that the deep things in science are not found because they are useful, they are found because it was possible to find them. And here he's expressing how scientists would stop at nothing to develop and understand the atom, and then be completely shocked and in wonder of how it could actually cause all this destruction. So where do you draw the line when it comes to science? When do you stop?
Yeah, that's true.
So please subscribe to our YouTube channel, but find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Pang Free to Air, and Star Times. Have a good evening.